Story 1.
"Please, sir, hurry up," she said, as she had repeated so many times that day, with an almost dreadful persistence. Her rural accent. She stretched out certain syllables. My voice sounded completely unmelodic against hers. Like a snake, she led me through the forest, her light leather boots barely leaving a trace on the frozen snow, as if she were some woodland spirit. Some kind of supernatural, ethereal being. Wrapped in a dark cloak, she blended into the surrounding gloom of the slowly approaching darkness. With her tiny hands, she held a scarf tightly against her head, further blurring the contours of her human form. And it became harder and harder for me to keep up with her. I gasped for breath in the icy cold air. I stumbled under the weight of my gear. The journey seemed endless. I couldn't understand how she could recognize the surroundings, how she could find the right direction. The rays of the sun were hidden behind an impenetrable wall of trees. Yet she walked confidently, always at the same pace. I barely managed to check our direction from time to time with the brass compass strapped to my left wrist. The already deep shadows grew longer, the temperature dropped, and the surroundings slowly drained the life from me. Night was closing in. The only way to her village was usually by the river. Upstream. But it was frozen. It was buried under large snowdrifts, making it even harder to get through. So, the only viable path lay through the forest. Strained and dangerous. I knew this couldn't go on much longer. That my strength was slowly ebbing away. And the shadows kept growing longer. "Stop for a minute," I shouted, panting, as I leaned against a tall tree. Under my leather gloves, I could feel the rough surface of the cold bark. I didn't bother to check if she was listening. I dropped my leather bag into the snow and took a few deep breaths. For a while, I fumbled with the buttons with frozen fingers before I managed to pull out a glass vial filled to the brim with a violet liquid. I unscrewed the cap with my teeth and took a small sip. It was bitter. Yet almost immediately, I felt the fatigue drain from my body. In its place came a strange manic state, where I could walk for dozens, maybe hundreds of miles without a single stop. Warmth spread through my limbs again. Only when I had thoroughly wiped the vial did I notice Ziva staring at me intently. Her green eyes seemed to glow with some forgotten inner light. I returned her gaze and pointed at the vial with the cap. She stepped back, as if I had burned her. I had to smile. Poor, naive girl. "We must keep going, sir," she almost whispered, and I noticed how her thin, fragile hands holding the cloak trembled. I nodded and swung the bag back onto my shoulders. It felt much lighter. Everything was much easier now. I hurried after the girl effortlessly because the potion had worked on me. I no longer sank into the snow, only moved through it with an unnatural ease. We reached the village with the last rays of the sun. As night took over the world, the mocking sounds of nocturnal creatures echoed through the forest, making it clear that we no longer had any business there. That it was their time, the time of wolves and bears. I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. Terribly hungry. Our arrival couldn't go unnoticed. I asked Ziva to take me to the only local tavern. Then she left me and ran off to find someone who held sway in the village. As soon as I sat down on a rough wooden bench, I ordered something to eat and a local beer in a wooden mug, and a crowd began to gather around me. But no one said a word. Rather, a circle of bearded, frightened villagers formed around me. All men, all of them wrapped in cloaks similar to the one Ziva wore. Some of them clumsily hid axes and long knives beneath their garments. What if this was a trap? If they wanted to, they could kill me. I wouldn't have time to reach any of my potions, and a revolver wouldn't be enough for all of them. They might go mad. Books had been written about villages like this, and how such villages eventually disappeared from the face of the earth. They watched as I ate a full bowl of porridge with smoked meat, and washed it down with thick home-brewed beer. They whispered among themselves, but no one addressed me directly, which was a relief as I needed to recover my strength after the potion and after the grueling march. At least I tried to nod to them, but only earned more embarrassed looks. Maybe they were just assessing me, the man who came to rid them of a ghost. I wondered what they could make out. 5 feet 7 inches tall asterisk, glasses with gold frames, wiry build but prone to stoutness. Not even 30. Certainly not the 6-foot-tall, scarred killer who could take on a werewolf. But they didn't seem that disappointed. Or at least most of them didn't. Rather, there was a hint of respect. Perhaps because of the long revolver that peeked out from the holster on my left side. I doubted they'd ever seen one like it. They looked at it with almost religious reverence. And they would never see one again unless another like me came here. But they all knew what it was, from tales and stories. "Sir," a voice suddenly called from the inn's doorway. A man in his 50s entered, obviously having quickly dressed in his best clothes, which must have been uncomfortable in the cold outside. His gray hair fell over his forehead. His face was lined with wrinkles and a few scars. His left eye was covered with a leather patch, but his right eye watched me very closely. "Vladlin, at your service. I'm the head of this village, dear sir. Thank you for coming," he said in the same accent as Ziva. It sounded strange to my ears, but endearing. "It's my duty," I replied, gesturing to the bench across from me. "Sit. Have a drink with me. And Ziva, too. And I want to know exactly what's going on here. And please don't leave anything out this time." The girl looked as if she felt a little awkward, the only woman in the hall. Nevertheless, after a brief hesitation, she obeyed. And with her, of course, came Vladlin. I took another sip of the beer. It wasn't bad. It had a pleasant taste and filled my stomach with a strong malt flavor. A bit unusual. The village elder pulled me out of my thoughts about the foamy drink when he took a deep breath and began to speak. Slowly and cautiously, as if trying to recall every detail. Well, at first we didn't put it all together. When it all started, it wasn't cold yet. We cut trees in the forest. We always prepare them for spring when the river swells so we can easily float them down to the valley. He spoke with many pauses and breaks. Occasionally he stopped, took a sip, or pondered, while the rest of the villagers nodded along. The Baron's men always wait for us there. And that day, Lek's boy helped us. Dushan. Then he fell silent. He seemed unsure of what to say next. And the villager whose son he had mentioned looked as if that hideous vision had reappeared before his eyes. "And what happened?" I turned to Ziva, who lowered her eyes. She did not answer. "We found him a week later," Vladlin said. "Or at least what was left of him, found halfway to the forest. We thought it was a bear. It happens sometimes. When someone isn't careful enough, it can be dangerous around here." He added this, gesturing to the patch over his eye for emphasis. "Who found him?" I asked. And I pulled out a large leather-bound notebook, in which I began taking notes with a pen made of bullbone. I needed to gather as much information as possible without missing a single detail. Even these actions, quite ordinary for me, provoked another round of astonished looks and whispers among the villagers. I suppose it earned me some points. "My brother," Ziva muttered so softly that I could barely hear her. Perhaps that explained why she had been so reluctant to share information during our daytime run through the forest. "We found him dead some time later," one of the villagers said. His gaze was heavy, almost challenging. There was almost no respect in it. But by then, he had already started acting strange. We thought he was affected by what had happened to that boy, but... "Mladen didn't kill anyone," Ziva shouted angrily, and it seemed like she was about to lunge at the tall man. But Vladlen stopped her and continued the story. Thankfully, because I couldn't help but notice that the villager seemed to be reaching for something inside his coat. "We don't know what really happened, and no one blames him, but we all saw it," he told the girl. Then he turned to me. "We found Mladen in a deep ravine. His body was badly broken. At the time, we thought it was just an accident. He often went hunting, and the forest in autumn is treacherous. Maybe he looked a bit strange, but what corpse doesn't?" He sighed and gestured to the man who had spoken earlier. Then Mara, Goran's daughter, disappeared. The first snow had already fallen. She wasn't even 9 winters old yet. She didn't come home that evening. In the morning, we went looking for her, with hounds which easily picked up her trail. Deep into the woods, but they led us back to the village. At first, we thought they were losing the scent, but they pulled us straight to Mladen's grave. There were claw marks all around, signs of dried blood. When we dug him up, we found claw marks on the coffin and 2 bodies inside. Vladlen paused again, taking several deep breaths. Goran seemed to be holding back tears with all his strength, never taking his eyes off Ziva, still gripping something under his cloak. However, before anything could happen, the elder continued. The girl was disfigured. Mlad. Something had gouged out both of her eyes, and there were wild wounds on her body. We only recognized her by her hair color. There was blood everywhere. An awful lot of blood. Mladen's corpse looked like time hadn't touched it, until we noticed his teeth. They weren't normal human teeth, but long, wolf-like fangs with bits of flesh between them. We burned both bodies, and what remained we threw into the river through a hole cut in the ice. We thought it was over, until another girl disappeared a week ago, Mona. That's when we sent for you. None of us can stand against such forces." "My brother." He silenced Ziva with a wave of his hand, and he glanced at the 2 yellowed pages of my notebook, filled with my notes. The drying ink was barely visible in the dim light of the tavern. "I'll find out what happened here," I said calmly. "I'll find out what's going on, and who is responsible. And what about Mona's body? Did you find it?" "No, sir," one of the villagers said. "We really looked everywhere. For example, I went through the neighboring caves. It's a real mystery what that werewolf did." "Did you crush the bones and mix them with salt?" I asked again. And this time, no one answered me. However, their looks were enough for me to understand that they hadn't done it, and the burnt skeletons had simply been shoved under the ice. Maybe they hadn't even waited for the bodies to burn completely. Maybe the smell of burning, rotting flesh had frightened them. I looked from one face to another. The villagers all stared at me. There was no confidence left in their eyes. I needed to see the bodies. But they had been burned. Especially Ziva's brother, if he really was a lycanthrope. I needed at least a drop of his blood. If he was a werewolf, how could he have died from falling off a cliff? And why did he only kill children? None of the villagers' weapons could have harmed him. But there were too many people here for this to be a hoax. Each one would have had to play their part perfectly. So many questions. Few answers. I had to consult the books I'd brought with me. I also interviewed the parents of the murdered children. But I learned nothing new. No one had seen anything. Naturally. Sometime later I lay under furs in a small, well-heated room. It belonged to the inn, and was said to be intended for visitors like me. The bed was clean, no lice. By the light of a candle I read the old books I had brought with me when a timid knock sounded at the door. Midnight. I instinctively reached for my revolver. If there was even the slightest chance that a werewolf was on the loose, I needed to be ready. It was Ziva. I gestured for her to enter and sit on the bed. She wore only a simple shirt. Her hair was braided into 2 long plaits. Only now could I finally guess her age. She was no more than 16. She noticed the open leather-bound book I was reading, and looked at it with a clear, almost reverent awe. "You know my brother is innocent, don't you? That he couldn't have done it?" she asked softly. Well, that was the reason for her visit. I closed the door and shook my head. "For that I need to see his body," I said. "Then what good are they?" she whispered, perhaps a little disappointed. "We said it might have been him," I replied, perhaps a bit harshly. "They told me that with this curse he could survive whatever happened to him, that it might put him to sleep, survive the fire, regenerate, that he could still be out there, trapped in some twisted form, coming back only for revenge. No, don't turn away." I grabbed her hand, and I saw tears welling up in her eyes. "I know he didn't do it," she whispered. "He couldn't have done it. I wanted to tell you everything on our way here, but I couldn't. He couldn't have done it. He was always so kind. The best boy in the whole village. Everyone said so. Tomorrow we'll go to his grave, and to the places where the children disappeared. Then I'll be able to tell you more," I said, gently squeezing her hand. She flinched as if my touch had stung her. Perhaps it was then that she realized I was holding her hand. She looked at me with a strange determination in her eyes. She rose from the bed. She stood right in front of me. "Promise me you'll convince the others that it wasn't him. And I'll do anything you want, if you're interested in me, dear sir." It was clear what she meant. She was desperate. Beautiful with that simple rural beauty. Tears glistened in her eyes. The sudden change almost frightened me. I had a few options. I could promise her anything just to have her body, and then break my promise if it turned out her brother was alive. But I'd risk a knife between my ribs, or I could reject her outright. But I would miss out on the pleasures her body could offer. In truth, given my position, I could take her against her will, and promise her nothing, command her to lie with me. But I liked best the option of waiting, letting her go, saying a few words, and if it turned out that her brother was never that monster, I could remind her of her promise. I liked that possibility best. So I let her go, studied the books for a while, and went to sleep. I hid the pistol under the pillow. The next day, shortly after the winter sun rose, I stood with the elder Vladlen and the girl Ziva by her brother's open grave. She gave no sign that she was thinking about the offer she had made to me the night before. A few villagers watched us from a distance, but no one came too close. Traces of frozen blood were visible everywhere. I collected a few drops, but something told me they belonged only to Goran's daughter. But that was all. It was all I could gather. It had all happened too long ago. I simply stared thoughtfully at the deep hole in the ground beneath the toppled headstone and pondered. Knee-deep in snow, with the cold wind cutting through me. The forest loomed nearby. Strange, unidentifiable sounds came from it. It seemed hostile. I finally realized there was nothing more I could learn. We had already examined the places where the children had disappeared, where they were last seen. Nothing. Barren and empty. All evidence had been lost to time or wiped away by the villagers trying to purge the evil with fire. And I felt nothing, just vague hints. Moreover, I hadn't found any traces of the missing girl or her body. And it seemed that even the villagers, including her parents, had already resigned themselves to the fact that she was dead. And that her body wouldn't be found until spring, when the snow melted. Because she lay somewhere deep under the snow. Poor Mona. I heard she wasn't even 10. There was only one way to get closer to the truth. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small bottle filled with thick green liquid. I held it up to the light. It wasn't cloudy. It hadn't spoiled yet, luckily. Otherwise, it could poison me easily. My hands trembled as I opened it. True sight, it's dangerous. I was playing with fate as I swallowed the liquid. Because the world was full of hunters who had quite literally fallen apart. They went mad because they couldn't handle the potion. And they spent the rest of their lives in felt-lined underground chambers, battling inner demons. "If I lose consciousness, drag me to warmth," I whispered. "If I resist, force me. Don't listen to what I say. If I don't wake up, send for help." I waited until Vladlin nodded before I took a small sip. And it nearly knocked me off my feet. Almost immediately, a burning fire spread throughout my body. I staggered, feeling Ziva supporting me. My vision changed. The world started to spin, and my mind began filtering out everything non-essential. I had to suppress the urge to vomit with sheer willpower. With each passing moment, it got worse and worse. I was slowly losing warmth. I felt myself growing cold. But I looked around with a completely new perspective. I knew that at that moment my face was completely expressionless. I expected the girl to recoil from me, as she had done the day before when I drank a potion much weaker than this. But she didn't. She just trembled slightly, like anyone faced with a power they couldn't understand. At first I saw nothing, then a small flash. Still held up by Ziva, I went completely blind. I pulled away from her and dropped to my knees. I dug through the snow with my bare hands until I found what had caught my attention. True sight. Not some conscious part of my mind. It was a doll, made of cloth and rags, with long hair, simple yet beautiful, like Ziva. But unlike the toy, Ziva's face wasn't painted with a little girl's blood. I would later test it, but even then, I knew deep down that blood once flowed through the veins of a young girl. And someone had painstakingly crafted that design. This wasn't the work of a cursed beast. It was the work of a human. "If this belonged to Goran's daughter, then it wasn't a werewolf that killed her," I whispered. "Werewolves are mindless, bloodthirsty creatures, driven by the instincts of their curse. But this was done by someone with intent, with passion, and with a twisted pleasure. A human." And with that, I lost consciousness. The potion overtook me. I woke up much later, drenched in sweat after long hours of mad dreams in a bed. A cold compress rested on my forehead, and the first thing I saw was Ziva smiling at me. I was back in the room where I had spent the night. Vladlen told the others what you found. Most people don't know what to believe. Can you hear them? They're all neighbors, arguing. The sound of the argument indeed reached my ears. I tried to sit up in bed, but my head spun. I was sure I recognized Goran's voice. He sounded very angry. "I need to get out there," I said, "before they believe the words of some dissenting fool. Help me." I dressed as best as I could, at least in the essentials. And, leaning on the fragile girl, I stepped into the tavern. The argument stopped immediately. Dozens of pairs of eyes fixed on me. Vladlen jumped up from his bench to assist me because Ziva struggled to bear my weight. "Goran, your daughter wasn't killed by a werewolf," I said, looking directly at the villager. "Perhaps none of your children were." He didn't seem convinced. He stared at me with a mixture of fear and anger in his eyes. "Then who?" asked one of his neighbors. "One of you. Maybe possessed by an evil spirit. Or perhaps entirely aware of what they were doing. But not a werewolf. He was smart enough to hide the last body before I arrived, because he knew I could identify it by the wounds. And I will find out who it was. I swear. And then I'll deliver him to God's judgment because he deserves nothing less. I will question each of you, and none of you will be able to lie to me." They took me back to my room. Silence filled the hall, and then, after a while, a persistent whisper followed behind me. I collapsed onto the bed with relief. I knew I must have looked terrible. Deeply sunken eyes and a deathly pale face, trembling like a drunkard. "Thank you for your help, Vladlen," I said to the elder as he stood in the doorway about to leave the room. He turned to me and gestured to his eye patch. "No need, sir," he replied calmly. "I think in the end, you managed to convince them." Exhausted, I fell onto the bed. I knew that the next day, I might be able to function, at worst, with the help of some weaker potion. I did it again. Another journey with true sight. Ziva helped me lie down. She undressed me, as my fingers no longer obeyed my commands. However, I managed to think a bit. About how if anyone fled during the night, they would be the guilty one. I expected her to leave, but instead she pulled her shirt over her head. Before me appeared a young, supple body, and she slipped into my bed to fulfill her part of the bargain. I didn't protest. I was tired and a bit puzzled, but not too much. And so I readily accepted everything she offered. This, too, was part of life. Not refusing gifts that unexpectedly fall into your hands. I don't know how late into the night I woke, but I felt an empty space beside me. She must have left when I fell asleep, but her scent still lingered in the air. I turned over, buried myself deeper in the blanket, and fell back to sleep. A few hours later, I was woken by a noise, and it wasn't Ziva. One of the shadows was darker than the others. Someone was in the room with me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I sensed him. Slowly, I reached under the pillow for my revolver. It wasn't there. Of course. Ziva had put me to bed, and I'd been too disoriented that evening to care. It was probably still hanging in its holster with my clothes. Or worse yet, it was already in the hands of the stranger in the room with me, though I doubted anyone from the village would know how to use it. I had to wait until he came closer. It was dark, so dark that I couldn't tell if he had a weapon. I was a fool, a terrible fool. I thought the killer would run. Instead, he decided to kill me, and in doing so, conceal the truth. I should have guessed. It made sense, and I couldn't blame him. In his position, I might have done the same. I sensed rather than knew that he was close to me, and I lunged at him from the bed. He wasn't expecting it. He groaned lowly, but I felt the sharp blade of a knife bury itself deep into my thigh. I shoved him away. I took advantage of the moment of surprise and rolled off the bed toward where I hoped my clothes, and with them, my gun, were. I almost cried out in excitement when my hand closed around the cold metal. But by then, my attacker had recovered. I barely had time to pull the trigger before he lunged at me again. He was stronger, but fortunately, he lacked agility. Finally, I managed to squeeze the trigger. The flash of black powder lit up the room. I fired again, and again. I shot into his body with silver bullets until he collapsed onto the floor. I felt my own blood running down my right thigh. My blood. I stood up cautiously. Voices could be heard outside. The shots must have woken someone. I sat carefully on the bed. I lit a candle. The flickering light illuminated the room. One of the villagers lay on the floor, and I vaguely recalled seeing his face a few times before. Probably first in the tavern, when he mentioned searching the caves for Mona. He was dead, having bled out from multiple wounds. I made a makeshift bandage for my own wound, ensuring it wasn't too dangerous, and covered it with a healing potion. My leg burned. I felt the wound slowly knitting together. I couldn't help but wince. The door burst open, and several villagers stormed in, armed with pitchforks and axes. At first, I thought they would attack me when they saw their dead neighbor on the floor. And I was holding a gun, its barrel still smoking with deadly intent. It must have all seemed very strange. I didn't drop the gun. They could have been his accomplices. If they killed me like this, the village would turn to ashes. That was my safeguard. Still, I preferred to explain quickly. "He's the murderer," I hissed through gritted teeth. "He tried to kill me to cover up his crime. Search his house, find Mona. Or at least her body. Search the cellar and the attic. Bring me Ziva, quickly." I was left alone. I searched the dead man's pockets. I found a few long steel claws. So if the werewolf had killed me, my death would have been yet another piece of evidence of its existence. An unsettling thought. But I was far from understanding why he did it. He was certainly just a regular human, not controlled by any dark, mysterious force. I discovered his motive much later, when Vladlen and I found poor Mona's body. It was enough to simply explore the caves that this same villager had supposedly promised to search personally. In reality, he killed her there, as he had done with all the others. I just wasn't sure whether Ziva's brother's death had been an unfortunate accident that he exploited, or if the brother had been on to him. The little girl was tightly bound, covered in blood and semen. She looked like an icy sculpture, her eyes wide open, staring into the unknown. I don't know if she froze before or suffered through the horrific torture, and I don't want to know. I have never seen anything worse. I've encountered many beasts, read about many more, but none were as heartless and cruel as this. He must have been sick. But in recounting this, I'm skipping over another event, just as tragic. The werewolf who was supposed to kill me was none other than Ziva. We found her dead too, right here. He must have killed her when she was leaving my room. I've told myself many times that I should have detained her. But at that moment, I just didn't see the point. He had knocked out all her teeth. He buried them. And in their empty sockets, he glued wolf fangs. They looked completely natural. I wasn't surprised that the villagers were confused. And I'm sure that if they had found her next to my torn-up corpse, with those fangs, maybe even with a silver bullet, everything would have been clear. At her funeral, I leaned on a cane to avoid putting too much strain on my healing leg, wondering what would have happened if she hadn't run out of the room. I convinced the villagers that there was no need to burn the bodies. I'm sure that Ziva found her brother. Silly village girl. And yet, a lone tear ran down my cheek.
Story 2.
The scent of prey drives him mad, pushing all his senses to the limit. Speed, sight, smell. The thunderous pounding of his heart echoes in his ears. He races through the night forest, spurred on by the burning thrill of the chase. Ahead, the haunches of the exhausted deer veer, sensing its imminent death. The beast knows its strength is fading, and in panic, it begins to dart wildly from side to side. The scent of the deer's fear fills the wolf's head, driving him to frenzy. Food. Soon. Close. The prey is almost within reach, ready to pour hot blood into his jaws. He growled in anticipation, baring his teeth. A distant echo of human consciousness suddenly picked up a plea for help, but the wolf merely twitched his ear, swatting the thought away like a bothersome fly. It was time for the hunt. It was his time. The plea came again. Desperate. Terrifying. Sending a chill of fear through the human side of his soul. The wolf snarled in frustration, maintaining his speed. The prey was almost his, nearly in his grasp. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Not after tracking it for so long. Inching ever closer. Yet again, the desperate plea rang in his mind, filled with animal fear, despair, and a certainty that he would come. With immense effort, as though struggling through a thick, unyielding barrier, the human consciousness overpowered the frenzied wolf. The beast receded into the background, snapping its jaws in frustration, watching the fleeing prey vanish into the dark. The thrill of the chase began to fade. The blood-red haze clouding the beast's mind slowly dissipated. The wolf sat down, snorted and froze, ears pricked, listening intently. He reached out mentally towards the source of the plea, and with a haunting howl, he sprang to his feet, a black streak racing back through the night. He tore through the tangled underbrush, covering the distance at a breakneck pace. Just make it in time, the human part of him thought. Tear them apart, the wolf mentally howled, eager to rip apart the traitors. 3 miles out, he caught the choking scent of smoke, and a chilling, sorrowful howl echoed through the dark forest. In the distance, the night sky glowed with the fiery light of a blaze. He burst out into the clearing just as the cabin was engulfed in flames. The yard was trampled by heavy footprints and drenched in familiar scents. The windows were boarded up, the door firmly barred from the outside with a heavy log. Inside, silence reigned, broken only by the crackling of burning timbers. The plea that had reached his mind was now silent. He could no longer sense her gentle presence. The massive werewolf charged the cabin, leaping to smash the log aside, turned and lowered his broad head, smashing through the locked door without a glance at the dancing flames. Scorching tongues of fire lashed out at his face, singeing his fur. He lunged forward, through the flames, darting around the burning cabin, searching for his family. The scorching floorboards seared his sensitive paws. Acrid smoke stung his nose, throat, and eyes. He found his wife near the hearth, wrapped in a thick blanket. She lay lifeless on the floor. The werewolf seized the edges of the cloth with his teeth and quickly dragged her out of the burning cabin. He unwrapped the charred fabric with his nose, and finding no sign of his daughter, he darted back into the deadly blaze, guessing where the frightened child might have hidden. The blazing cabin began to collapse, charred beams crashing down, the ceiling sagging, on the brink of collapse. He quickly realized how the mother might have tried to save her child and dashed back to the hearth. The stove was tightly closed with a damper and covered by a smoke-stained cloth. He pushed the scalding metal plate aside with his muzzle and found his 3-year-old daughter curled up on a bed of straw, covered in soot. Ignoring his smoldering fur, he gently wrapped the child in the cloth, clumsily using his nose and broad paws, then picked up the bundle with his teeth, and, with his ears pressed back, leapt through the flames. Bursting out of the collapsing cabin, the werewolf placed the child beside her mother, pushing away the burning cloth, and cast a quick glance at the chimney. It was blocked. Those bastards had thought of everything. He whimpered softly, nuzzling their bodies with his scorched muzzle, clinging to the faint hope that he could still wake them. But they wouldn't wake. The wolf sniffed them, whimpering quietly, gently touching their faces with his nose. He understood. He raised his enormous head to the dawn-streaked sky. A mournful, pain-filled howl rang out across the woods, a sound so haunting and desperate that it sent shivers through the night. And then, beside the woman and the child, a black-haired, still young man fell to his knees, sobbing. He held them close, rocked them, kissed their lifeless bodies, pleading with them to wake, sobbing bitterly and whispering words of love. He begged for forgiveness, kissing them again, holding them tightly, over and over, imploring Mara to bring them back, to take his life instead. It was because of him they had died. Because of him they had come. And he hadn't sensed the danger. He hadn't arrived in time. He had let the beast take over. Mara remained silent, unwilling to exchange her prize for a scorched hound. And the man continued to cradle his dead family, burying his face in their cold hands, kissing them, weeping, blaming himself, begging for forgiveness. His jet-black hair, like frost, slowly turned gray. If only I hadn't gone so far. If only I had heard. If only I had turned back right away, he thought, cursing himself, feeling like a traitor. She had called to him until the very end. She had waited. She had believed. He had promised her that with him, she had nothing to fear, that he would always protect her. He hadn't heard, hadn't protected, hadn't saved. Their deaths weighed on his conscience. When he finally came to, dawn had taken over the sky. The cabin still burned with a hellish red flame, consuming what was left of the ruined home. The man cast a grim look at the waking sun. "How could you allow this, Great One? Aren't you the master of the flames, the protector of fire?" The bastards had chosen the filthiest time, night, when the cradle of the gods hides beyond the horizon. They say the gods are blind to what happens below during the night. Those wretches had only made one mistake. He was out hunting, not inside, and they would pay for it. He wouldn't defile the memory of his family with hasty revenge. First, he would say goodbye to his loved ones, send them on their final journey as they deserved. Gently, the man placed his daughter's cold body on her mother's chest, as if she was tenderly embracing her child. Then, carefully taking them in his arms, he carried them into the forest. All day, he prepared a final cradle for his family, a place to bid them farewell before they began their new journey in the halls of Mara, the one who gives life. He chose the quietest, most secluded spot, far from where the villagers usually roamed, the edge of a small meadow where sky-blue flax bloomed nearly all summer, a favorite of his gentle wife. He laid them down gently like the most precious of treasures. He kissed his peacefully sleeping wife and his tiny daughter, fragile like a porcelain doll. One last time he ran his fingers through his wife's soft silken hair, saying goodbye. Morning. When the last notes of the burial song faded, a massive silver werewolf sank to the ground. His once black fur was now forever mixed with gray, in some places burned away, exposing raw patches of skin. He didn't wait for nightfall. Unlike the superstitious villagers, he knew that the gods saw everything, always. And he was going to collect his bloody harvest under their open gaze, unhidden. The wolf returned to the smoldering cabin, sniffed the air, and his eyes filled with bloodlust, his mind clouded by a haze of madness. They knew he would come, knew it the moment they realized he wasn't in the house, when they heard his heart-wrenching howl in the woods, a sound that sent chills through everyone who stood by the burning cabin. He walked heavily, each step thudding against the ground, filled with a roiling fury and a thirst for blood. Black death awaited those who had dared to touch what was most precious to him, for those who had betrayed his trust. He smelled their fear long before the first houses of the village came into view. The stench clung to the entire area, seeping into his sensitive nose, provoking the hunter within. The wolf growled with satisfaction. Let the prey tremble, let them shiver in terror, stoking his hunting frenzy, clouding his mind with a blood-red veil. The werewolf entered the village, making no attempt to hide, and announced his presence with a piercing howl. Let them know he had come for them. Let them shiver in fear. Let them feel the terror of death, feeding him with its dark, cloying power. First, he visited Wojciech. The scrawny, pale man had blocked every entrance and exit, tightly boarded up the windows, and barricaded the door from the inside. Foolish. It wouldn't save them. No one would escape justice. The wolf easily broke through the makeshift barriers and prowled through the empty cabin, the wooden floorboards creaking under his massive paws. Smirking inwardly at human stupidity, he stopped by a heavy square trapdoor. Wojciech, along with his family, hid in the cold cellar. A cellar. If only they had had one, perhaps his family could have hidden from the choking smoke. Perhaps they could have waited for him. He could have saved them, pulled them from the burning cabin alive. The scoundrel trembled like a leaf, already understanding what awaited him. As soon as he caught sight of the wolf, he collapsed to his knees, turning ghostly pale, begging for mercy, pleading for his life, not for his family's, for his own. Pathetic, despicable bastard, the werewolf thought in disgust. Why? He growled, looking into the eyes of his former friend. That was the last coherent thought before the wolf tore into his liver, and without mercy, ripped apart everyone in the house. Next was Boleslav, a stout, unpleasant man with a scraggly goatee. He hadn't hidden. No, he waited on the porch, gripping a sharpened pitchfork, grinning with wicked glee at the pain he'd caused. "Why?" the werewolf growled again. "You killed my Aneshka," the man said grimly, glaring at the huge beast from under his brows. "I didn't touch her," the wolf snarled, bristling, baring his fangs. "I already told you. I didn't touch her." "I know it was you. It was you," the man insisted, his eyes feverishly bright. He lunged with the pitchfork, aiming for the werewolf's head, but the wolf was faster. He leapt forward, sinking his teeth into the man's neck, tearing it open, spilling hot blood onto the cold ground. He died there on the porch, pitchfork in hand, his empty, lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. The next one had hidden in the corner of his cabin, clutching a bundle of charms meant to ward off evil, muttering prayers to the many-faced one. The werewolf grinned in savage delight, savoring his fear. Hypocritical bastards. So now he was a demon? And how long had they seen him as a cursed being? Or had they always thought him dirt, but stayed silent while he was useful? He remembered how often they had come to his home, asking for help with hunts or to find lost children in the woods. They had come, eaten at his table, smiled, asked for his aid. Scum. The feral wolf crept closer, savoring the terror of his prey, to the trembling, fat man with greasy eyes. He growled, baring his teeth, drool dripping onto the worn wooden floor, and with one swift motion he tore into the man's face, feeling the crunch of bones between his jaws. "No, please. Spare her." A woman's desperate cry rang out as she ran through the village toward the house. The werewolf slowly shifted his bloodshot gaze to the young unarmed woman running towards him. He curled his lip, revealing crimson-stained fangs, snapping out of his bloody trance. Before him, huddled under the porch, was a terrified little girl, barely 5 years old, her tear-streaked face flushed red. And there he stood, his scorched fur bristling, his jaws dripping with thick, bloody drool. She begged for mercy, too. The wolf growled, his hackles rising, his blood-streaked muzzle drawn back in a snarl. The words came with difficulty. "She pleaded for you not to hurt the child," he snarled, baring his teeth further. "I didn't know what they were planning," the woman sobbed, rushing to fall to her knees before him, shielding the child with her body. "Please, spare her. I beg you, don't hurt her. She's innocent." The werewolf bristled, his fangs gleaming in a guttural growl, ready to lunge. And then he remembered the terrified look in the girl's eyes, so much like his own porcelain daughter. He flinched, ears flattening like a chastised pup, and in horror at himself, he fled, leaving behind a bloody trail in a village nearly emptied of its people. He ran without seeing the path, whimpering and losing his mind to the agony tearing him apart. And then he scrubbed himself clean in the river, trying to wash away the blood, the sticky scent of death, before returning to his family's grave, where he lay down to stay, never again taking on his human form. The remaining villagers heard his haunting, sorrowful howl for many long weeks, a sound that chilled them to the bone, until one day they realized the wolf was gone. In the dead silence of the dark room, where light barely filtered through the dusty shelves, I cautiously made my way between them. My heart pounded wildly, responding to every rustle in this grim labyrinth. She was here in the shadows, an elusive presence hunting me. Her footsteps were heavy and uneven, and I could feel the chill and terror in the air. I tried to move quietly, but the sound of my steps seemed loud in this eerie silence. I stopped, hearing a rustle very close by. In the darkness, behind one of the shelves, I saw a distorted silhouette. For a moment our eyes met, and in hers I caught a glimpse of something familiar, evoking an instant wave of pain and pity. I delved into my thoughts, trying to reconstruct the chain of events that led me to these unfortunate circumstances. And then, the pivotal moment resurfaced in my memory, the beginning of it all. It was a call from John that set off a series of incredible and tragic events. It was a sunny Sunday morning. I stood in the supermarket parking lot, waiting for my friend John. The parking lot was empty, as all normal people were still asleep at this early hour. Forcing someone to get up so early on a weekend was a form of sadism that my friend possessed in full. Just a few days ago, he had called me while I was repairing another laptop at the computer repair shop where I worked. "Hey, David," he said. "I've got good news for you. This Sunday we're going camping out of town." "No thanks," I automatically declined. I knew you'd say that, but I have one argument that'll make you agree. Guess who else is coming with us?" "And who might that be?" I grumbled. "Emily, my boring friend, that very Emily. She'll be bringing a friend along. So, do you still not want to go?" Damn, John hit a sore spot. He knew I had been crushing on her for a long time. So here I was, getting up early, taking a shower, and carefully combing my hair, standing in the parking lot, waiting for the girl of my dreams. Soon, I saw my friend's pickup truck driving down the empty highway. It was painted a deep black, with fiery waves of red-orange shades on the sides, creating the illusion of flames engulfing the vehicle. On the hood was an imposing, aggressive-looking vinyl decal of a skull surrounded by electric guitars and lightning bolts. I think this truck fully reflected my friend's character, a reckless guitarist in a heavy metal band. I recalled an incident that had happened to him recently. Every year, our town hosted a music festival, held outdoors, attracting many rock music fans. John, unable to resist impressing the crowd, decided to use his pickup as part of his performance. Armed with an electric guitar, he drove straight onto the stage in his pickup, as lightning and flames flashed on the screens, created by special effects. Stopping right in front of the crowd, he turned his audio system up to full volume, turning the pickup into an impromptu stage. Then, standing on the roof of his pickup, John began to play a guitar solo, synchronizing his performance with the deafening riffs blaring from his car speakers. At that moment, the stage was lit up with bright spotlights, and artificial smoke began to pour from special machines, adding to the dramatic effect. John played like a man possessed, stunning everyone with his passion and skill. At the end of his performance, he pulled off an incredible stunt, jumping from the roof of the pickup straight onto the stage, never stopping his guitar playing. People talked about this event for a long time. John was always the life of the party, a person whose cheerfulness and boundless energy drew people to him. But someone once said his thirst for adventure would eventually end in trouble. I agreed with that, but there was nothing I could do about it, as he was my only friend. When the pickup stopped next to me, out came a medium-height guy with long, curly hair, a confident smile on his face, and eyes gleaming with excitement and enthusiasm. He was wearing a black t-shirt with a skull and worn jeans. This was John. He walked up to me, slapped me on the shoulder, and asked how I was feeling. I replied that everything was okay, but my gaze was fixed on the car's interior, from the back door of which two girls were emerging. The first was Emily. She was short, with long, soft chestnut hair tied in a loose bun. Her bright blue eyes attracted attention with their simplicity and sincerity. Following her was her friend Sophia, a tall girl with long black hair, dressed all in black, emanating a gloomy atmosphere and looking somewhat detached. When Emily approached us, she responded to my greeting with a sweet and slightly embarrassed smile, while her friend merely nodded in acknowledgement. We hadn't even started talking when a gray Prius quietly pulled into the parking lot, and out came a somewhat plump guy wearing large, thick glasses. I knew him. It was Patrick, but everyone called him the Professor because he always studied hard and loved to share his knowledge, even when not asked. From the passenger seat emerged someone I wanted to see the least. It was a blond guy with neatly combed hair, blue eyes, and a confident smile. Many called him handsome, but only I knew how rotten this playboy's core was. His name was Tyler. I never liked him, and everyone knew it, especially John. I shot John an angry look, to which he quietly whispered in my ear, "Sorry, man, when I invited Emily, this guy was hanging around and started inviting himself. I couldn't refuse." I elbowed John in the side. What annoyed me most about Tyler was that he constantly hit on Emily. She politely brushed him off, but he didn't stop trying. Apparently, he decided not to miss his chance this time either. As we gathered in a circle, an awkward pause ensued, which John, of course, broke. "So, folks, we're going to a place my uncle's friend told me about. The views are amazing. There's a river nearby. We'll set up camp and have a blast." We nodded without much enthusiasm. Before leaving, we went into the supermarket and stocked up on food and drinks. In the outdoor section, I noticed bear spray. Taking it in my hands and examining it, I heard a snort behind me. It was Tyler. "What? Scared of bears?" he asked mockingly and laughed as he walked away. "Jerk," I thought to myself, and still put the spray in the basket. Soon we loaded everything into the pickup's bed and set off. I sat in the passenger seat next to John, fortunately with the girls in the back, and a disgruntled Tyler who had tried to ride with us, following in the Prius. Soon we left the city. The destination was about 50 miles away. The journey was pleasant, the road taking us farther away from urban life, with the surroundings becoming increasingly wild and untouched with each mile. Upon arriving, we found the perfect spot for our camp. It was on a small elevation, offering a view of a wide, calmly flowing river. The river's water was clear and cool, sparkling under the evening sun. Dense forests stretched along both sides of the river, creating a sense of seclusion and peace. We decided to set up camp on a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. There was enough space for our tents and a campfire. The forest made quiet sounds, the rustling of leaves, the singing of birds, and the distant noise of the river. The air was fresh and filled with the scents of pine and earth. After pitching our tents, we gathered firewood. It was already around noon, so we decided to have lunch. Setting up the grill, we roasted some meat. Soon, a pleasant aroma spread throughout the area. Satisfied and content, John burped and patted his belly, earning a reproachful "John" from Emily, and then decided to break the silence. "You know, guys, this place is great, but my uncle told me about another spot nearby. Should we take a walk and check it out?" The real reason we were gathered here, I thought. In my experience, John's ideas never ended well, but I noticed curiosity and approval on the others' faces, especially Emily's. Everyone began agreeing, and not wanting to be seen as a coward, I also agreed. Everyone started getting ready to head out. Just in case, I took a backpack, where I put a compass, flashlight, water, and that bear spray. John also had a bag, with a large box inside, judging by its shape. This made me wary. What was he planning? Soon we set off. The forest was dense and impenetrable, full of the whispers of leaves and mysterious sounds of nature. Following a narrow path, we made our way through the thick undergrowth, where each step was noticeably harder than the last. The light filtering through the dense canopy created a dappled pattern of light and shadow on the ground. From time to time, we stopped to breathe in the fresh, forest-scented air and listen to the sounds surrounding us. Distant bird songs, the rustling of small creatures hiding in the bushes, and the mysterious noise of the wind among the branches. As we progressed, the forest grew thicker, and the path became barely visible. In some places, we had to push through thickets. After a long journey through the forest, we finally emerged into a spacious clearing. Unexpectedly, we found ourselves in front of an old wooden house hidden among the trees. It seemed surprisingly well maintained despite its age. The house was built of dark wood, its roof covered with moss, and the windows adorned with carved shutters. We cautiously approached the house, scrutinizing its details. The wooden planks of the walls were expertly joined, and on the porch stood old but neatly arranged chairs and a small table. Everything around was quiet, with only a light breeze rustling the leaves. As we began to examine the house, an elderly man suddenly emerged from it. His thick beard was silver gray, and his gaze was wise and penetrating. He was dressed simply, in an old-fashioned shirt and worn trousers. His appearance startled us a bit, especially the girls who hid behind our backs, with Emily, to my delight, hiding behind me. The man stopped on the porch, looked at us intently, and said, "You seem lost. Don't be afraid. I've lived here for a long time and helped many lost tourists. You just need to turn south now, and you'll see a path. Follow it, and you'll reach the road." John intervened. "No, sir. We're not lost, just wandering. We saw the house along the way and were curious. Sorry to bother you. Goodbye." And he turned and headed north, and we uncertainly followed him. The man, seeing where we were going, shouted after us, "Wait, don't go that way. It can be dangerous." "Don't worry, sir. We're just taking a walk and we'll return soon," John replied without looking back and continued on his way. The professor caught up with him and whispered, "Maybe we should listen to this man. He wouldn't warn us for nothing." "Don't be afraid. My uncle's friend has been there 1,000 times, and even if it's dangerous, it's so cool to find out what's going on there." John responded with his eyes shining. My companions began to glance at each other fearfully. "You've all fallen into my friend's trap, who is always looking for trouble," I thought. I even started to feel guilty for not warning the others that this walk could be dangerous since John was the initiator. Soon we disappeared behind the bushes, the man standing with his mouth open and his hand raised. Then he waved it and muttered something like, "I warned them." We continued our way, John trying to lighten the mood, constantly joking and laughing loudly, talking to the girls. I walked behind, envying how easily he could talk to people. I wanted to talk to Emily, but didn't know where to start. My chance came a little later when I saw that she had lagged behind, looking for something on the ground. I approached and asked what she had lost. "A bracelet. I recently knitted it," she replied. Like a knight, I threw myself into the search and soon found it. It was a beautiful knitted bracelet made of threads, indicating that the maker had considerable knitting talent. My joy knew no bounds, especially when she smiled at me with her bright smile. "Thank you," she said. "My grandmother taught me to knit. It's a kind of reminder of her." "You're welcome. By the way, you're really good at it." "Maybe you could knit me one as a thank you?" I asked cheekily. She smiled and was about to respond when suddenly something moved in the bushes. It was something huge and hairy. It was hard to see and say anything definite about it. Emily got scared and hid behind me. I guessed it might be a bear and reached into my bag for the spray. But suddenly everything went quiet. Sophia and Tyler ran up to us, asking what we were doing and eyeing us suspiciously. Emily began to explain, saying she had lost her bracelet, and I had helped her when we saw something like a bear in the bushes. "A bear?" John asked, surprised as he approached. "There are no bears in this forest. Maybe it was a boar." "Maybe," I replied uncertainly. But it seemed too big for a boar. John walked into the bushes where we had seen the creature, then looked around. Finding nothing, he called us to follow him since we were almost at our destination. Soon John stopped and looked around. Giant pine trees grew all around, completely blocking out the sunlight, creating a dim twilight. He then bent down, searching for something on the ground, and soon a victorious shout echoed. He called us over and showed us what he had found. It was an iron hatch. The surrounding ground was covered with moss and fallen leaves, making it almost invisible if you weren't looking closely. The hatch looked old and rusty, made of heavy metal. It was square-shaped with a recessed handle for opening. There were no inscriptions or markings on it, only the traces of time and corrosion. John tried to open it, but it was locked. Then John took off his backpack and pulled out a drill box labeled 850 watts and boasting that it could drill through any metal. Taking out the drill, he saw our surprised faces and explained that his uncle's friend had found this hatch recently and told John about it. Then, determining roughly where the lock was, he began drilling. There was nothing for us to do but sit nearby and wait for him to finish. After about 20 minutes of drilling and constant tugging at the handle, the hatch finally gave way and opened. We crowded around the hole and peered inside. The hatch descended deep into impenetrable darkness. You could climb down using a vertical ladder made of rebar. We looked at each other, waiting for someone to volunteer to go first. Then everyone looked at John since it was his idea, but suddenly Tyler volunteered. Apparently he wanted to show off in front of the girls. Making a serious, heroic face, he took a flashlight and began to descend. We watched him. After a while, he disappeared into the darkness. We waited to see what would happen. About 5 minutes passed, but there was no word from Tyler. Then John leaned over and shouted into the hatch at the top of his lungs, "Tyler!" Suddenly, a beam of light hit him straight in the face, suggesting that electricity was still working down there, much to our surprise. Then we heard Tyler's voice, shouting for us to come down. John was the first to start descending, followed by the others. I brought up the rear. Honestly, I didn't really want to go down there. I looked around. It seemed like no one was around, but as my head was almost submerged in the hole, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. I stopped sharply and began to peer in the direction of the bushes, but saw nothing. A bad feeling lingered. Sighing wearily, I continued my descent. The shaft was about 30 feet deep, which seemed quite deep to me. Finally, I jumped onto the level floor and looked around. We found ourselves in a long, narrow corridor. The walls, covered in pale gray tiles, had held up fairly well, though there were chips and discolorations here and there. Weak but working neon lights flickered on the ceiling, creating a grim but sufficient illumination for inspection. The floor was covered in linoleum, which had peeled and curled in places, exposing the old concrete beneath. On both sides of the corridor were heavy metal doors with numbers and markings, many of which were already rusted and dusty. Some doors were ajar, leading to rooms that once served as laboratories or experiment chambers. The glass in some doors was broken, revealing dark, abandoned rooms. Along the length of the corridor ran pipes and wires, some of them sagging or detached from the walls, testifying to the long-gone days of activity. The air was filled with the smell of mold and old electronics, and the silence was broken only by our footsteps and a distant hum coming from the unknown depths of the laboratory. Everyone stood, curiously looking around. It was astonishing that this place still had functioning elements. I saw Tyler standing proudly near an electrical panel. The professor, especially excited, always loved places like this. He entered one of the rooms, then peeked out and beckoned us over. When we entered, we saw an old laboratory. The walls of the room were lined with old, peeling white tiles showing signs of age and long-dried stains of unknown substances. In the center stood a long work table covered in a layer of dust. Scattered across the table were various lab tools. Test tubes, flasks, pipettes, all coated with a thick layer of dust and forgotten for many years. In the corner of the room was a cabinet filled with numerous glass jars, many of which were still sealed, containing unknown chemical compounds, colored solutions, and powders. Some jars were broken and their contents had dried up, leaving colorful traces on the shelves. An old microscope, covered in dust, stood on one side of the table, as if forgotten in the middle of an important experiment. Next to it lay notes and records on sheets of paper, their ink faded, making the text barely readable. Spreading out around the room, we began examining everything. The air was filled with sighs and exclamations of amazement, especially from the professor, who nervously moved from one corner of the room to another, excited by the discovery. Meanwhile, I noticed John carefully placing several tools into his bag. Suddenly, the sound of breaking glass and a frightened scream echoed. I quickly turned and saw Emily with a cut finger, which was stained green from the liquid in the broken test tube, whose shards lay on the floor. Rushing to her, I pulled out a water bottle and a bandage to immediately clean the wound and prevent infection. After all, no one knew what was in that tube. Carefully treating and bandaging the wound, I breathed a sigh of relief, seeing that the injury was not serious. Emily smiled gratefully at me, and I felt incredible happiness from being able to help. Seeing that everything was okay, John warned everyone to be more careful. We continued exploring. Exiting into the corridor, we began to peek into each room one by one, but there was nothing of interest until we heard a loud, frightened scream. We turned and saw Sophia running out of a room we had not yet checked. Her face was scared, and she was trembling all over. We asked what was in there, but she didn't answer immediately, instead pointing a shaking finger at the door. "There's something horrible in there. I can't," she stammered. "You have to see it for yourselves." We decided to check it out and cautiously entered the room. When we saw what was inside, we gasped in fear. Everyone reacted differently. John whistled. Tyler jumped back in fright. The professor tremblingly fell to the floor, and Emily screamed and covered her mouth with her hands. I simply stood, dumbstruck and mesmerized by what lay before us. In front of us stood a huge capsule about 10 feet in diameter, filled with a shimmering green liquid. Inside, suspended in this mysterious substance, floated an enormous head resembling that of a wolf, but many times larger and with distinct differences from a regular animal. This head looked more like a monster from a fantasy story, with sharp fangs and grotesque, unnatural features. To grasp its size, imagine an adult man spreading his arms wide but still unable to encompass it completely. Around the capsule were numerous wires connected to various devices and screens that blinked and displayed various data and graphs. These screens seemed to monitor the condition or some parameters of the capsule and its contents. The room was dimly lit by the monitors and the soft glow of the liquid in the capsule, creating a gloomy and mysterious atmosphere. We stood, stunned by this sight, trying to understand what kind of experiment this was and what its purpose could be. Once we came to our senses, we began to look around. John pulled out his phone and started filming. We moved closer and looked at the head inside. Up close, it seemed even more realistic and terrifying. Have you ever been to a zoo and seen a tiger? It seems like a regular big cat on TV, but when you stand next to it, you realize it's a truly massive beast. Here was an enormous head, so how big was the body? Was this a monster the size of a dinosaur? Could it be a dummy? Possibly, but the head looked too realistic. Thoughts like these swirled in our minds. Talking or making noise in this atmosphere was frightening. It seemed that if we did something wrong, this creature would awaken. We stood a while longer, studying everything around, and then decided to leave. As I was leaving the room, I swear I thought the creature's eye moved in our direction. I caught the slightest movement of the pupil. Frightened, I recoiled and quickly decided to exit the room. The others looked at me in surprise, but I just shrugged, saying nothing because I didn't want to be seen as a coward. I could see that everyone was starting to get nervous and there were already suggestions to return, but John insisted on exploring a few more rooms. Reluctantly, everyone agreed. Moving further down the corridor, we discovered an evacuation plan and realized that this laboratory was huge. We had only explored a small part of it. The professor pointed to a room labeled Archive. We decided to go there. Soon we found the right door and entered. The room was spacious, with high ceilings and shelves filled with old books, documents, and boxes. The shelves held stacks of dusty folders, tapes, and old reels. The air in the archive was heavy with the smell of old paper and metal. In one corner of the archive stood a video viewing device, an old film projector which seemed like it might still work. Next to it was a table with several film reels on it. These reels were neatly labeled, and we realized that they might contain valuable information about the lab's past research. Examining the reels, we chose the one labeled General Analysis and Conclusions. Preparing the projector, we inserted this reel. Once the device was turned on, the archive wall turned into a screen, showing frames from an old film. The image was black and white, a bit shaky but clear enough to make out the details. We held our breath in anticipation of learning the secrets hidden in these old records. The screen showed a man in a white lab coat standing next to a huge capsule. He seemed vaguely familiar to me. To date, it has been 65 days since the start of our research, he began his report. We have discovered that the head in the capsule is alive but does not respond to external stimuli. However, our experiments with its blood have shown astonishing results. On the screen, the scientist paused, sighed, and continued. This blood contains a virus that interacts with human DNA, causing genetic changes that lead to physical transformation. We discovered this, unfortunately, due to a tragic accident. One of our scientists had direct contact with the blood of this creature. After 2 hours, the transformation occurred, and the victim turned into a wolf-like anthropomorphic creature and began attacking everyone around. We barely managed to neutralize this being and then began studying how to combat this virus. Suddenly, the image on the screen flickered and the video skipped ahead. We have developed an antidote, the scientist continued, holding a vial labeled HN13. It must be administered within the first 2 hours after infection to prevent the transformation. The first signs of infection include a sharp increase in body temperature, changes in eye color, accelerated hair and nail growth, as well as increased physical strength and aggression. We sat in front of the screen, listening intently to what the scientist was saying. Emily was sitting to my right. I looked at her, and she noticed, looking back at me with her warm smile. My heart froze in fear. Her eyes, which had always been so clear and kind, had suddenly changed. They had become bright yellow gold, reminiscent of a predator's eyes, reflecting light in a way that left me speechless for a moment. In that first second, I couldn't even believe what I was seeing. I remembered the scientist's words about the change in eye color. Emily saw my reaction and got scared too, asking, "What's wrong? Is there something on me?" Your eyes," I said with difficulty, feeling a heavy burden from the bad news. Everyone turned, hearing our conversation, and Sophia covered her mouth in horror. Tyler ran up to Emily, grabbed her shoulders, and looked into her eyes. Then he fearfully took a few steps back. Emily pulled a small mirror from her bag and brought it to her face with a trembling hand, staring at her eyes for a long time before tears streamed down her cheeks. It seemed the test tube she had cut herself on contained the creature's blood. We all sat in stunned silence, not knowing what to do. I approached her and hugged her. She buried her face in my shoulder and sobbed loudly. My chest ached, and I replayed the scientist's words in my mind, remembering that he mentioned an antidote. I gently pulled away from Emily and approached the projector. Rewinding the reel back, I paused the image on the moment where the scientist held the vial. I pointed to it. "We need to find this within an hour and a half, since it's been half an hour since the infection. The vial labeled HN13. We'll split up. Each of us will take a wing of the building." A spark of hope ignited in me and spread to the others. Even Tyler nodded in agreement. We divided the areas among the 5 of us, leaving Emily to sit in the archive. I set a timer on my watch and ran with all my strength. Every second was crucial. Soon I reached door number 37, labeled Experimental Laboratory. I yanked the door open and burst into the room. It was shrouded in a gloomy atmosphere filled with shadows and cold. Surrounding me were rows of capsules, each containing dead chimeras immersed in green liquid. These motionless creations, a chaotic mix of different animal parts, were a haunting reminder of the horrific experiments conducted here many years ago. The air reeked of decay and chemicals, making my throat clench with revulsion. I had no time to study my surroundings. My head swiveled in search of the antidote, but it was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, I noticed a dark figure gliding in the shadows. I quickly hid behind a nearby table, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. When I dared to peek out, a horrifying creature lunged at me. Its eyes burned with yellow fire, and its sinister fangs glinted in the flickering light. Its fur was dark and thick, and its muscles twitched with rage and power. Instinctively, I jumped back. The beast lunged again, smashing capsules and splattering green liquid everywhere. Glass shards flew, and the grotesque creatures fell to the floor with a wet thud. I thought it was the end, but at the last moment I remembered the bear spray in my bag. Grabbing it, I quickly turned and sprayed the beast right in the face. The spray worked. The werewolf howled in pain and fury, knocking the spray from my hands and breaking it. Clutching its mangled face, it fled into the dark corridor. What was that? I stood in shock, surrounded by the wreckage of the laboratory. Breathing heavily as if after a sprint, I tried to calm down and collect my thoughts. Could there be other infected creatures here? I needed to warn the others. But first, I thoroughly searched every corner, finding no antidote. I ran into the corridor, but it was empty. I remembered everyone had scattered throughout the building, and finding them now would be problematic. I checked my watch. Time was running out. Hoping the others were okay, I ran, checking each room along the way. Finding nothing, I started to wonder what to do next. Standing in the middle of the corridor, I suddenly heard a terrifying scream of pain. I ran towards it and saw that the others had also gathered: Sophia, Tyler, and John. It felt like a plunge into icy water. Professor was missing, and it was likely his scream we had heard. My companions exchanged frightened looks. John asked, "What's going on?" I didn't explain, but ran into the room from which the scream had come. It was a large room filled with archive documents neatly placed on shelves that resembled library sections. Shelves stretched along the walls and throughout the space, creating narrow passageways between them. The air was filled with the faint smell of old paper and dust, and the dim light from rare lamps gave the room a gloomy and mysterious atmosphere. We cautiously made our way between the rows of shelves, looking for signs of the professor. However, what we found was worse than anything we could have imagined. Behind one of the rows, in an alcove between the shelves, we saw my friend's body. It was brutally mutilated, as if attacked by a monster. Pages and documents were scattered around, creating chaos and disorder. The floor was smeared with blood that had not yet fully dried, and the air was thick with the sharp metallic smell. This discovery froze us in horror and grief. Sophia was trembling with fear, her face pale. Tyler squatted, trying to comprehend what had happened, and John stood in the corner, nervously fidgeting with his flashlight. Perhaps he blamed himself for bringing us here. I sighed and recounted what had happened earlier. They listened, terrified. Sophia turned and said we should run and call for help. I thought it was a wise decision, but then we wouldn't be able to save Emily. It was selfish, but I could only think of her. Tyler volunteered to go with Sophia while John and I decided to stay and continue the search. Suddenly, a menacing growl echoed. We quickly turned around, realizing the danger was near. Sophia panicked and ran for the exit. We followed her, finding the corridor empty. Sophia hurried toward the hatch through which we had entered, with Tyler following. John and I stood there, pondering where the antidote might be. Suddenly, we heard a noise and simultaneously looked up. Something was crawling along the ceiling, or rather inside the ventilation system. John and I exchanged glances and understood how this creature moved. To our horror, we realized it was headed where Sophia and Tyler had gone. We ran after them. I checked my watch. Only half an hour left. A knot tightened in my chest. Would we make it in time to save Emily? The creature moved quickly, and soon the noise in the ventilation system quieted ahead. We ran as fast as we could, rounding corners and trying to speed up. When we were almost at the hatch, we saw at the end of the long corridor the werewolf jumping on Tyler, who fought with all his might to fend it off. To our horror, we saw Sophia's body lying near the struggle. John ran faster and kicked the creature, sending it flying against the wall. It hit the wall and collapsed to the side. Growling heavily, the werewolf slowly began to rise on its hind legs. I ran to Tyler and helped him up. We stood facing each other, waiting for the first move. The werewolf was breathing heavily, its chest rising and falling, green liquid dripping from its mouth. We noticed it was crouching, preparing to jump. Suddenly we heard a noise, as if someone had fallen from a height onto a marble floor, followed by gunshots. The werewolf was shot midair and, spraying green blood, fell right in front of us. Twitching in convulsions, it let out a pitiful moan and died. In shock, we turned around. Standing near the exit staircase was the elderly man we had met at the house in the forest. In his hands was a large double-barreled shotgun, smoke rising from its barrels. He approached the creature, bent down to ensure it was dead, then rose and walked over to Sophia, checking her pulse. Sighing regretfully, he told us she was gone. We stood in sorrow, looking at her body. The man pulled us from our thoughts. We need to leave quickly. It's not safe here. I was about to thank him for saving us and tell him about Emily, but when I looked closely at his face, I remembered where I had seen him. It was not for nothing that I thought the professor in the video looked familiar. It was our savior. I ran to him and grabbed his sleeve. "Sir, it's urgent. Where can we find the antidote? Our friend is infected. You have to help us." He gently pushed me away, then sighed heavily, slinging his gun over his shoulder, and said wearily, "There is no antidote. The last doses were destroyed, and the scientist who developed it lies before you." We looked at the werewolf's corpse in confusion, and the man continued, "It happened 30 years ago during a catastrophe here." "What do you mean there's no antidote?" I cried desperately. Then I checked my watch, only 15 minutes left. I turned and ran back to the archive where Emily should still be waiting for us. Behind me, I heard the man shouting, trying to stop me, but I kept running. They had no choice but to follow. Soon we arrived at the location, and I burst into the room, but to my horror found no one. Desperately, I called Emily's name, but there was no response. I was about to run out to search for her, but the man grabbed me firmly, preventing me from escaping. I looked at him angrily, but he said, "Calm down. I need to explain. It's too late to do anything. Going after her will only put you at risk." I tried to break free from his grip, but John and Tyler came over and placed their hands on my shoulders. I was angry and wanted to hit them for being traitors, but John quietly said, "Calm down, my friend. Let's hear what he has to say." I reluctantly nodded, and they loosened their grip. The man released me, stood in front of us, and began his story. "First, let me introduce myself. My name is Alexander Weiss. I used to work as a geneticist at the local university. We studied the genetic basis of diseases and everything related to it, uncovering complex connections between heredity and health." He placed his rifle on the table and began pacing the room, recalling the past. One day, a man approached me. As far as I knew, he was very wealthy and influential. Before telling me what he wanted, I was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I immediately understood the seriousness of the matter. A car was sent for me, and we drove to the mountains nearby, where there was an abandoned mine. The place was cordoned off, with armed guards all around. They searched me and took me inside. After descending quite deeply, we found ourselves at an entrance formed by a collapsed wall, leading into a massive cave. When I entered the cave, a breathtaking sight unfolded before me. It resembled an ancient temple. The walls were adorned with mysterious symbols and drawings depicting animals, astronomical signs, and incomprehensible writings. The air was filled with a sense that each symbol carried a part of a long-forgotten history. In the center of the cave, on what looked like a stone altar, lay a gigantic wolf's head. Its powerful fangs and dark fur with unusual markings evoked a mix of fear and admiration. The head's eyes were closed as if this creature were frozen in time, like a sacred artifact or object of worship. Around the altar were various items that seemed to be used in ancient rituals: old vessels, stone knives, and amulets. Dim light filtered into the cave through narrow cracks, creating a mystical atmosphere, and I felt that each step was filled with mystery and ancient magic. I was sent here to study what this creature was and what it was capable of. So I got to work. Day after day, we conducted experiments, uncovering new information that stirred the mind. Soon, this laboratory was built, and we continued our research until the first case of infection occurred. That's when we realized the blood of this monster contained a virus capable of altering human DNA and transforming them into monsters. Legends and myths were becoming reality, which both frightened and inspired us. One day I noticed the head was still alive. I mean, we had previously discovered that there were signs of life in it, but no consciousness. It was like a vegetable. But then I saw the head responding to my movements. It did so subtly, so I wouldn't notice. This frightened me so much that I couldn't sleep for several days. I couldn't imagine what would happen if this monster woke up. I tried to avoid it, but I didn't realize that my colleague, Leonard Hoffman, was constantly near it. He was a brilliant scientist who developed the antidote serum. Apparently, he either contacted the head or fell under its control. I'm not sure. The important thing is, He intentionally infected himself. This happened on the day the lab owner arrived. All the staff, all the lab personnel, and the owner gathered in the conference room. It was a trap. 15 minutes before the meeting, Leonard asked me to check the monster's head. I went to the lab, while in the conference room a massacre was happening. Leonard locked all the doors and, transforming into a monster, began killing. No one survived. When I returned to the conference room, I saw a pile of bodies. Suddenly, Leonard attacked me in his monstrous form. Luckily, I always carried a weapon designed to repel these creatures, which we had developed earlier. I barely managed to escape. When I returned fully armed, the monster had fled. I didn't know what to do. Reporting this lab to the government could have led to a catastrophe, as the virus in the head's blood is extremely contagious. I decided to shut down the lab and settled nearby, tracking and hunting Leonard. For 30 years I couldn't catch him, but today it finally happened. That's roughly what happened here. But I want to highlight a couple of points. From my observations, Leonard has become much weaker over the years. Their peak strength is at the beginning of the transformation. Secondly, before transforming, they become quite vulnerable, lose their mind, and move purely on instincts, making them almost impossible to find. That's why I didn't let you go. You would have been lost in the depths of this lab. We listened in shock, as if pulled from a science fiction novel. I remembered Emily, recalling how kind and sweet she was, how brightly she smiled, and my heart ached with pain. Dr. Weiss continued, "Now you understand why we need to leave. That head is alive and extremely dangerous, but I must stay and kill the creature your friend has become. After the transformation, they become utterly insane and less cautious, making it a chance to put her out of her misery." He then stood, took his gun, and left. I couldn't believe my ears and rushed after him. "Wait, isn't there a way to cure her? Maybe she can be saved," I asked hopefully. "No, she could only be cured before the transformation. After that, it's impossible," the doctor replied, turning to look at me deeply before placing a hand on my shoulder. "I understand how hard it is to lose someone you care about. But you must accept that the girl you loved is gone. Now go to the exit. I must do my duty." I stood, lost in thought, not knowing what to do. My friends came up to me and said it was time to go. I watched the doctor walk down the corridor. Suddenly, a monster jumped out from an open door and attacked him. It happened so fast that we couldn't react before the professor's head rolled on the ground and blood spurted from his neck. The monster approached the body and stood on its hind legs, roaring. We were paralyzed with fear. The werewolf turned to us, slowly opening its formidable jaws full of sharp giant fangs. Its fur, colored in shades of chestnut like Emily's hair, gently swayed in the airflow from the fan. "God, Emily, what have you become?" I thought sadly. Suddenly the monster lunged at us, and we rushed into the nearest room, slamming the door. There was a loud bang as the door shook. The monster growled in frustration and then went silent. We sighed in relief, but then heard a noise from above. Something was moving through the ventilation system. Then, just a few dozen feet from us, the ventilation grate fell to the floor, and the werewolf jumped out. In panic, we rushed to the door we had just closed. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with the lock. Finally, with relief, I heard a click. The door opened. We scattered in different directions. I chose the room across the hall. I didn't see where the others went. My entire world had narrowed to the creature chasing me. It seemed to have chosen me as its target, slamming into the door behind which I was hiding with enormous force. This was the same room where the professor had died. This time, the werewolf wasn't looking for a way through the ventilation. It decided to break down the barrier. I stood there, unable to look away, watching as the creature repeatedly threw itself at the door until it broke through. Not waiting for it to enter, I ran along the shelves. Hiding in a corner, I crouched, trying to quiet my breathing. I felt the presence of the werewolf, its heavy steps causing the walls to shake. With each movement, dust rose into the air, creating ghostly shadows. It seemed I could hear its breathing, low and steady, like the sound of an approaching storm. My heart pounded wildly as I slowly moved from one hiding spot to another, trying not to make any noise. Adrenaline coursed through my veins and fear filled every cell of my body. Suddenly there was a loud noise. The werewolf had found my hiding place. It growled, its eyes glowing in the darkness, reflecting a yellow light like burning coals. It charged forward, smashing everything in its path, its claws scraping against the metal shelves. In desperation, I dashed out of my hiding place, sprinting across the room towards the exit. The werewolf followed, its roar filling the space, making the blood in my veins freeze. I glanced back one last time, seeing the enormous creature breaking through obstacles as if they were made of paper. With the last remnants of my strength, I dashed out of the room, the werewolf hot on my heels, its steps drawing ever closer. A sharp gunshot shattered the silence, once, then again. The monster let out a long howl, full of pain and rage. Turning around, I saw John, armed with the doctor's shotgun, firing at the werewolf. Despite its injuries, the creature lunged at John with incredible speed, knocking him off his feet with a powerful blow. The werewolf slowly approached John like a predator, ready to deliver the final blow. In desperation, I rushed towards them and grabbed the shotgun. The monster paused, meeting my gaze. From behind me, Tyler emerged, shouting for me to shoot. "One shot to the head and it's dead!" His voice sounded like a sentence. But I hesitated. Tyler also had feelings for Emily, and now he was demanding that I kill her. Standing there indecisive, I watched as the werewolf turned its attention back to John. A shot rang out, smoke rising from the barrel of the shotgun. I missed. I didn't want to hit. The werewolf met my gaze, and I swear deep within its eyes I saw that same warm look that belonged to the one I loved. With a roar, the creature dashed into the darkness of the corridor. Exhausted and overwhelmed with emotion, I approached John. He was injured but not mortally, likely with a few broken ribs. I helped him to his feet, draping his arm over my shoulder, and supported him as we walked. Tyler walked beside us, holding the shotgun I had given him, cautiously scanning our surroundings. Soon we left that place. Once we were in the forest and got phone reception, we called for help. After some time, the lab was cordoned off. John was taken to the hospital, and men in strict suits identifying themselves as FBI agents began interrogating us. We told everything without holding back, eager to get it over with. In the end, they asked me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I told them to go to hell. Surprisingly, they didn't push too hard, perhaps thinking that no one would believe such a story anyway. They did, however, confiscate our phones. After we finished all the formalities, I saw Emily's parents in the hallway of the department. They looked very sad, having been told that their daughter had died. I stood at a distance, unable to find the strength to approach them, and confessed that their daughter, having transformed into a monster, was now wandering somewhere in the depths of the forest.